Hello, I'm Bob Vanderpool, President of Crisis Care Network. When the stakes are high, we all want to serve as part of a great team, one characterized by unity of purpose, trust, and superior expertise. When a mass disaster strikes, the stakes are at their very highest, and we must do everything we can to have the best possible team, maximally trained and coordinated. CCN is pleased to announce its partnership with Black Swan Solutions and the development of a disaster assistance response team, also known as our DART team. With me today is Andrea Chiroff, Director of Disaster Management Services for Black Swan. Andrea is a recognized expert in aviation disaster response and will be providing today's training, victim and family assistance in the wake of mass casualty events.
Thank you, Bob, and we are delighted to be working with CCN and partnering in this important project. I would like to thank the responders for acknowledging their interest. Before we get into the training, however, maybe a bit of background would be helpful. Going way back, the 2nd century poet Juvenal said that some events are as rare as a bird as a black swan. So that term has been in use for a long time. However, more recently, popularized by Nicholas Taleb's book, The Black Swan, The Impact of the Highly Improbable. Now the term has come to mean a very improbable, highly unlikely event, but one that has widespread and significant impact. And it really does describe the kinds of things that we will be responding to. Certainly 9/11 comes to mind when you think about these very unusual, highly impactful events, but other things such as natural disasters, mechanical, man-made, these are the kinds of events that the Disaster Assistance Response Team, or DART, will be involved in and would be activated for. Having worked in this disaster management arena for the past 15 years, I would characterize this work as challenging, intense, but uniquely affirming. I think that you will find that the experience will certainly remind you why you chose a helping profession. And I think you will also come to see that you will get more than you give. Your life will be forever changed.
Thanks, Andrea. And thank you for joining the DART team and for taking this opportunity to upgrade your skills. Can you imagine a greater honor or a greater responsibility than to respond for people after this type of event? It's important work and we must do it well. The team is counting on you.
Welcome to Victim and Family Assistance in the Wake of Mass Casualty Events, Disaster Assistance Response Team Training for Behavioral Health Professionals. The purpose of the training is to prepare behavioral health professionals to effectively assist survivors, survivor families, and victim families in the immediate aftermath of an aviation accident or other mass casualty event. As a result of the training, you will be able to describe post-trauma reactions, define and apply the concepts of victim and family assistance post-event, describe the following roles: the airport family waiting area specialist, the uninjured passenger coordinator, the hospital coordinator, the family assistance center or FAC stand-up roles, the family assistance center specialist, and team leader. And finally, we'll conclude with the importance of self-care. As you can probably tell, much of this information is going to be unfamiliar. It does relate fairly specifically to the aviation industry. However, I do want to make you aware that we have other kinds of clients that certainly would potentially activate the same services. We're going to talk in a moment about the fact that the aviation industry is legislatively mandated to provide a certain set of services in the aftermath of an accident. We also have sports and entertainment venues as clients, among them professional sports organizations. So these kinds of events, certainly there is large crowd exposure, and certainly we don't have a list like we do in an aviation disaster with passenger lists available. So our focus and our intent is a little bit different because what we're basically doing is developing a missing persons list. The other thing about having these services in place is, quite frankly, it serves as a reputation management tool. In other words, the organization has considered the fact that, number one, a disaster may occur, and number two, they've given that enough thought to put some resources and services in place so that if something were to happen, the services can be activated and provided to those affected. And then finally, we have a group of clients who look to us to help them account for people as part of their evacuation process. We work with our clients in that regard in terms of being able to account for people that were on site at the time of a facility disaster. We certainly also have experience in helping organizations track their employees after a community disaster, and Hurricane Katrina comes to mind. One of the things that we helped a couple of organizations do literally is serve as an information center for employees that literally had scattered to a dozen states outside the Gulf Coast region. One of the things that I've come to believe is that it really doesn't matter what kind of disaster we're talking about. Disasters have one thing in common, and it is that it is all about effectively managing information associated with the people that are affected by the disaster. And I think at the end of the training you will certainly come to appreciate and understand that statement. I want to talk to you briefly about the unique experience that the loss presents to those who are affected by a mass disaster. Certainly many of you have experience in responding to critical incidents in the workplace, and there may have been a beloved employee that passed away suddenly, or potentially a small group of people personally affected. The thing that we need to remember is in these kinds of events, we are talking about a large number of victims. Certainly the death or the injuries are unexpected. Oftentimes they are unnatural, and by that I really am also referring to this violent destruction that often accompanies certainly aviation disasters and other kinds of events such as explosions, fires, and things like that. One of the very unique horrors, I believe, and it's something that you will come to further understand as part of this training, is that it's not just losing a loved one, it's losing them in a fairly horrific way, and then finally it is the possibility that you may never get your loved one back. Certainly 9/11 comes to mind when we think about this fact or this concept. The 3,000 people that died that day, among those, only about half, or 1,500, were ultimately forensically identified. So consider what that must be like for those families whose loved ones were never identified. They don't have anything to prove that their loved one passed away on the morning of September 11th. And what does that do to the grieving process? This is a very unusual and unique experience. Other kinds of implications are that, certainly there is widespread impact on communities. Survivor guilt is something that we hear about fairly frequently. I've sat in on people talking about aviation disaster experiences, and while we often think of those as being all fatal accidents, the fact is that many certainly have been accidents in which there were survivors as well as fatalities. I have heard people speak about the fact that they changed seats with somebody, or their reading light wasn't working, so they got up and moved a couple of rows away, and that's where the plane broke apart. One gentleman in particular comes to mind. He exchanged his seat with his wife. They had actually just been married, and he survived the accident and she did not. What does that do to your ability to work through that tragedy? So these are all things that we need to keep in mind when we talk about mass casualties, mass disasters. And then finally, I want to emphasize something for you. Certainly you all have experience in dealing with traumatic events, but these are kind of events that best thing I kind of can come up with for a description is what I call a double whammy. And it's important to recognize that it really is the trauma reactions that we are predominantly going to see in the immediate aftermath. So think prolonged disbelief and fairly significant emotional numbing. That is, I guess, what I'd call typical kinds of reactions among most people who are directly affected by disasters. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about reactions to trauma, but just as a quick review, these are, as I said, probably the more typical kinds of behaviors that are exhibited among most people. Cognitively, certainly there's a disorganization to thinking. People will talk about feeling numb. The word surreal is often used. That means this feeling of unreality, this can't be happening. Even physical numbness or hypo or hyperactivity, shortness of breath. And the coping mechanisms we have seen obviously the most is this profound and pervasive denial. The best story I can tell you about that comes directly from 9/11, my personal experience, in which we were operating a call center on behalf of the Department of Justice, Office for Victims of Crime. And somewhat interestingly, the City of New York and the Medical Examiner's Office and many of those employers that were in the Trade Center towers got together and determined a means by which family members could receive what are known as presumptive death certificates. And going back to something I said earlier, it took a long time to ultimately identify many of those victims. So in doing this or putting a process together, what they were doing is trying to speed up the fact that families would have a way of collecting life insurance and other kinds of benefits. Well, 2 weeks go by, 3 weeks go by, 4 weeks go by, and the big question on everybody's mind was, why aren't people applying for these death certificates? The fact of the matter is, most of the people, and we talked to thousands of people, most of them were not there yet. They had not accepted the reality that their loved one was gone. And so the death certificate presented a reality that they were not ready to face yet. And that is what I will always remember about 9/11. As a mental health professional, knowing what denial means, I have never witnessed and experienced how that played out among what was literally hundreds and thousands of people. I'm going to show you next a video that presents a history of aviation accidents. Don't worry, there's nothing gruesome in it. A little bit emotional, and while I'm thinking about it, just to mention, there are some videos within this training, and certainly if you find yourself getting a bit emotional at any point, please don't worry about that. You are the kind of person we want on this team. Family members over the years have told us that, the tears in the eyes of people who were helping, who were responding, let them know that people cared. If you're genuine and you are showing some emotion, that's nothing to get concerned about. So we're going to look at this video, and I want you to view it from the context of these were family members' experiences prior to passage of some legislation that we'll talk about next. So the legislation actually was passed in the fall of 1996. So keep in mind, again, that you're going to be seeing things and listening to vignettes that occurred prior to the legislation.
A new generation of news. Your first look at stories happening now. This is 12 News at 5.
Good evening, everyone. We begin tonight with a breaking story. Just a few minutes ago, 12 News learned a plane on its way to Ohio from Detroit crashed.
It happened about 40 miles south of Detroit in Monroe County. Now, here's what we know. It is a twin-engined, turboprop commuter plane with some 28 people on board. A Detroit television station reports everyone on board was killed. There are conflicting reports about exactly where the flight was headed, either Toledo or Cincinnati. Now, more details are coming in at this moment, and we'll update you as soon as we get more information.
Didn't really tell us much of anything, that they didn't have a manifest, passenger manifest, and gave me a phone number to call to try to get one, and I called that number and was unable to get anything confirmed.
And they did say they'd get back to me within an hour if they had any information, so that's why I'm going to get out of here and head to my house where I can take phone calls.
Why is it taking so long, you know?
Again, I don't know. I've been called in as a resource, and I don't know.
Everybody as ready as they can? Yeah. Okay. As I earlier told you that we contacted Galaxy and they were going to send a representative, and I told you when I got the information I'd be back out to make a statement to you. We since have been in contact with Galaxy, and they are not sending a representative to Minneapolis. If there are any questions, I can give you a telephone number for the gentleman from Galaxy to contact.
You have a manifest because we've been hearing rumors that there wasn't a manifest.
I do not have a manifest for the plane. That's all the more I can say.
You know
sorry.
if anybody else
What was the problem
does.
with Galaxy? That they said at first they were going to come and now they're not?
They did not give me a reason.
What was your reaction when they told you they weren't coming?
No comment.
When we got there, they instructed us to the outskirts of the airport to like a warehouse, and there was a sign, quarantine livestock area. And we just sat there and we watched in horror as they lifted his body off a forklift. John was a proud man, and I don't think they had any right to strip him of his dignity like this. We would have carried him off the plane ourselves. And to top it off, not a Pan Am representative or a State Department official was even there to shake our hand and say, I'm sorry. They didn't care. They still don't care.
We all have had we've had the media get information before we get it. And a lot of times it's not true.
No, they told me since day one, since I called yesterday morning, they said you shouldn't go there because there's nothing to collect.
No, I have, like I said, I have the crew names, but we don't know yet about the crew. They haven't told us anything. It has been a very slow process.
Can you give us an update of the fatalities, number of fatalities?
No, we don't have it. We don't have a number of fatalities. We don't have names of the fatalities. We don't know about our crew.
As far as summing up this whole, I'd never want to see one of these again, believe me. Never want to go through this again.
What is your name? We just saw an explosion out here at CMP 507.
CMP 507, I'm sorry, I missed it. You're out of 18, did you say something else?
We just saw an explosion up ahead of us here. Someone about 16,000 feet or something like that. It just went down to the water.
Virgin 009, I'm sorry, your transmission is broken up.
Handoff, please. The 9 o'clock position, sir. It looked like an explosion of some sort about maybe 6 miles out on my 9 o'clock position.
Roger that. Thank you very much, sir. We're investigating that right now. 2WA 800 Center, 2WA 800 if you hear Center ident. 2WA 800 Center. TWA 800 if you hear Center ident. TWA 800 Center.
I think that was him.
I think so.
God bless him.
So after having watched the video now, I think it's fairly evident that family members were angry. They felt that the airlines had not obviously been prepared to deal with the family's issues and needs. There was certainly the indication that information was not forthcoming, not expediently, not accurately, and in fact, many times the airline was accused of hiding. Now, having worked with the airline industry for the past 15 years, I'm absolutely convinced that it wasn't because the airlines didn't care. It truly was that they had no plan in place. I believe they did the best they could. In fact, just as an example of that, we're going to look in a moment about the legislation and the impact of that. But years ago, if you were an airline employee, and it didn't matter how long you'd worked there or how old you were, if you happened to be on duty at the time of an accident, you were expected to run out to that scene and try to rescue people. So I have talked over the years to people who did that, who spent time in the morgue. These are not things that the average employee is at all prepared to do. And so I believe truly that it wasn't that they didn't care, it simply was they didn't have a plan. Now, interestingly, the aviation industry and more recently passenger rail are the only two industries who are required to initiate a family assistance plan in the event of an accident. Other business and industry, this has not come to be a requirement. One of the things, and I'll just digress a moment here, one of the things that has been somewhat disappointing to me is that, I think we learned a lot from 9/11, and one of the things we clearly learned was that employers, regardless of the type, should have received the message that if something bad happens during a workday, those families of those employees have an expectation of you as an organization. And it is very simple. They are going to want to pick up the phone and call and get information about what has happened, and more specifically, what has happened to their loved one. That played itself out over and over and over again. And yet, here we are on the eve almost of the 10-year anniversary, and having now worked in the business continuity family assistance field for those 10 years, there are a lot of business and industry today who still don't quite understand why it's important to do planning around really your most important asset, and that's the employees that work for you and their family members who are going to have these expectations. So the legislation itself was obviously something that was not particularly welcomed in the aviation industry, but it really did draw a box around what the airline was required to do versus other entities. In just a moment, I want to backtrack just a moment. A couple of things from the video that I wanted to draw your attention to. The first one is that, it's important to remember that what we saw about the media portrayed in the video, keep in mind, these were incidents that occurred prior to '96. The immediacy and the tenacity of the media is that much stronger and pervasive than it was way back when. We have, 24-hour news, and so literally one of the things we'll talk about is, especially at the airports, the media will be there immediately, and they are all about getting the human tragedy story and hopefully be the first to break that story. So media, the role of the media, certainly they have a role to play, but they also become one of our greatest challenges in this response process. The second thing I want to draw your attention to briefly is the lady in the powder blue suit who talks about her husband, John. Her husband did die in Lockerbie as a result of the crash of Pan Am 103. And if you took her words at face value, did you not get an image of a body draped on a forklift? You remember she talked about how undignified that process was. And then to add additional assault, she talked about the fact that for whatever reason, the person making a decision about the process, apparently it made the most sense, maybe logistically, to do this at an area at JFK Airport that was typically used to quarantine animals. So we have a woman who was literally filmed 8 years after the fact. You saw how raw the emotion continued to be. These are the kinds of people who said, enough is enough, we have to make this better. And I draw your attention to her for another couple of reasons. One is she is a really good example of a secondary assault. And we all know this from trauma work. I don't believe that Pan Am or the people at JFK set out to further traumatize those families. But obviously, if only one person had looked at that placard on the wall that said quarantine livestock area and had said, oh my gosh, we need to take that down, what that experience could have been is possibility is very different. And unfortunately, sometimes it's in the littlest of details that family members' perceptions are going to be formed. So those are two things to kind of keep in mind and to tuck away. perception is everything, and sometimes it truly is in the smallest of details. I think she's also a very good illustration that this doesn't go away. And it was people like her that lobbied Congress. The summer of 1996, you may remember, TWA 800 crashed in late July. And literally by October of that year, they had passed this legislation, one of the most quickly passed pieces of legislation in our nation's history. And really what it did is, as I said, kind of put a box around the airline's role and expanded the role of the National Transportation Safety Board. That is the federal agency that is required to investigate not only aviation accidents, but train, marine, pipeline, bus accidents. What it did is actually divide that agency, or added to the agency, role of family assistance. And there are today a group of about 8 people who literally will respond to certainly every major accident, and they are there to ensure that the airline is performing as they said they would with regard to this legislation. The other benefit of the legislation, and it has been amended several times, is that it defined the role of other federal agencies and organizations. And what's interesting to me is that this really does make for a fairly straightforward kind of response process. There's no kind of gray or fuzziness as to who's supposed to be doing what. And we've seen that play out in other kinds of disasters. Katrina, of course, comes to mind. So what we have is that everybody pretty much understands their role and plays nicely in the sandbox. That is certainly not true in other kinds of disasters. One of the themes that came out of the family member testimony on Capitol Hill that summer was the awful, awful behavior by attorneys and insurance companies, and they described literally being surrounded by those folks circling like sharks. And so there is a moratorium today that places 60 days, a time frame that those insurance companies and attorneys are prevented from soliciting family members in that 60-day period. And that might not seem like a lot, but it is something that at least is in place that protects those very vulnerable people in that extremely difficult time in the immediate aftermath of an accident. The legislation set out basically to require airlines to now develop and submit a plan, and there are actually 32 separate tasks that are supposed to be performed. So some of those airline tasks are exactly why those airlines have contracted with us. They either do not have the personnel to perform those tasks appropriately, or even better, some of them believe that there is certainly value in integrating mental health support into the process. And so our airline clients are kind of a combination of all of those. So what is it that we more specifically might be doing on behalf of our client? Well, we'll talk about this later, and you'll have an opportunity to also go through some specialized training if you are interested in also serving in our crisis call center. This is literally a call center that is stood up specifically for mass disasters. And as I said, it is going to require some specialized training. But we are often the entity that is publicizing this toll-free number that starts to scroll on the bottom of the TV screen. One of the most major intents of the legislation is this whole notion that information in the past was not provided fast enough, accurately, and this really is kind of the crux of the legislation. Information to families as it becomes known. And that's going to play itself out in some of the roles that we're going to talk about a little bit later. The airline is also supposed to keep the public and the National Transportation Safety Board updated on how well it's doing in making notifications to the families. The next thing that you see here is that the airline is supposed to secure places at the departure, connecting or intermediate, and arrival airports. And the reason that's required is that we know families will not only pick up the phone and dial that toll-free number, but if you have just dropped somebody off at the airport or are going to the airport to pick somebody up, you are going to go into the airport seeking information about what has happened. And airline employees at the airports absolutely need to know what to do and how to best respond to families. After the notification process is completed, the next thing is pretty much offering travel and logistical support to families that will ultimately travel to the accident site city. Most families will do that. The airline is required to identify a hotel, generally a convention-sized hotel, offer transportation to that place there and back, and then provide meals and accommodations and other incidental support while families are there. One of the things that we do in the call center is make those arrangements. Another thing that we do is certainly maintain contact with those families who elect not to travel. And finally, the airline is required, and we typically will do that on their behalf, is to talk about and describe the need for potentially dental and medical records. And that goes back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of the frequent devastation and violent nature of these events that unfortunately do not allow loved ones to receive back a whole body, and that victim identification becomes a very complex and lengthy process. Most people are actually identified through dental or medical records. DNA is actually kind of a last resort strategy. So those were the mandates, or some of the mandates anyway, of the legislation. Today, I think we need to also talk about what has come to be expectations. Not necessarily legislated, but certainly these have become standard among airline disaster responses. First of all, probably 90% of all the families represented on board that aircraft are going to say, yes, we want to travel to wherever this city where the disaster has occurred. We want to be close to our loved one. We need to see something. And then, of course, it's not just 90% of the families, it's figuring maybe 4 to 6 people within that family are going to want to travel. So if we have an aircraft of nearly 200 people, we can do the math fairly quickly to very much realize we're talking about hundreds of people that are going to want to travel to the Family Assistance Center and become part of this process. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, information is what families expect, and they expect it quickly, and they expect it to be delivered compassionately and accurately. And we'll talk more about that. There has come to be kind of a pattern to how this unfolds. Family members have very much said, we need to see where was our loved one last. So whether it's the middle of a cornfield or on the ocean shore, that becomes very important. And what we call a site visit is typically going to occur around the 3rd, 4th, or 5th day. And usually towards the end of that week period, a memorial service is going to be held. So those two things have become very standard as far as disaster response process. The airline is also expected to pay for individual funerals and memorials. They're obviously covering the cost of recovering the bodies and the caskets and making that shipment back to the home cities of the victims. Grief counseling is often offered as part of that process. And then finally, something to also be aware of is this notion that, and it came from disasters years ago in which oftentimes the breadwinner, especially when not everybody got on airplanes, the breadwinner was typically the one who died as a result of the accident. And so families were left without income in the case of many families. So today, $25,000 is given to the next of kin, usually within the first 3 days or so. So families that travel to the hotel are probably going to be handed this check. Families that stay home will have that check hand-delivered either by somebody at the airline, or possibly that might be something we would call upon you to do. If you live in the home community of a family member and this is what needs to be done, that might be something you would be asked to do. But this is given to families in advance of litigation. It's presented in such a way that it's not taxable income, and yet it certainly does not negate the fact, and none of this negates the fact, the airline is definitely going to be sued. Family assistance is mandated, yes. A lot of money is going to be spent trying to address family members' needs, but families are absolutely going to also file lawsuits, and that's a given. The difference is if family assistance is done right, if families feel that their needs were addressed, that their concerns were heard, what ends up happening is more and more of those lawsuits will settle out of court, and that becomes huge in terms of a financial impact on the airline's future operational cost. So let's talk a little bit. I've used the word family assistance several times already. And interestingly, the legislation, which is called the Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Act, does not define what is meant by family. What the intent was, and still is that the airlines were encouraged to allow families to pretty much define themselves. In other words, who constitutes this passenger's family? And one of the definitions that we like and that we will use unless our client, our airline client, specifies otherwise, is that family is a bond created certainly by blood or marriage, but also relationships of emotional significance. So this, in fact, includes people like boyfriend, girlfriend, same-gender partner, fiancé. They may not have legal status, but they have a place in this family assistance process. So, a couple of things about family assistance in general. Certainly today, the way in which whether it's airline or other organization, how it responds to this disaster is definitely going to shape public opinion. It's certainly going to affect the way the victims view the organization, but it's also going to shape public opinion, and it may in fact affect the future of that company's viability. So the stakes are high. The stakes are absolutely high. What's even more important for you to remember is that you, as a responder, are representing the organization. You are representing CCN and our company, but you are, in fact, representing the organization. And your performance is going to affect the way families perceive how this disaster is being handled. So this is why we want you to have this specialized training, to be aware of the kinds of expectations that are going to be part of that process. So what do we mean by family, victim and family assistance? Well, if you look through this list, it's pretty simple, pretty much non-clinical, and that's something I want to take a moment to address. Some of the larger airlines, in fact many of the larger airlines in this country and even internationally, utilize their own employees to do much of this work. And as we talk about this a bit more, I think you will better appreciate what are the implications of that. So first and foremost, remembering, yes, you are potentially a clinician. You certainly have critical incident response experience, But we are talking about something very different, and you need to, first and foremost, take off your clinical cap. That is not what this assignment is about. You will see families at their most dysfunctional. You will see relationships and communication problems among family members, but it is not our role and our objective to be intervening in that fashion. We are talking about very basic kinds of things in what we want to accomplish, and it's the things that you see listed there. And if you're at all familiar with psychological first aid, it really is a very analogous kind of framework to consider. So, creating a supportive environment. Well, how do we do that? One of the things I want to draw your attention to is, you need to be comfortable with the expression of emotion, and you're going to see a range of emotion. You're going to see very, very tearful, and more often you're going to see that numbness that I described earlier. So that's one thing. The other thing is, what you do to create a supportive environment is you always, always follow through on promises. You are not expected to have the answers. You will not have all the answers, and you're not expected to. We're going to hopefully educate you as to where you can go for other resources to get some answers, but there's nothing wrong with saying, I'm not sure about that. I'm going to have to go check with somebody. The more important thing is that you follow through on that and you check with somebody and you go back to the person who's asked the question, what you were able to discern, or the fact that you haven't obtained an answer yet, and you're going to keep trying to do that. That's what's most important, because the minute that you fail to follow through on a promise, your credibility, the trust that has been established with people who are highly vulnerable and highly sensitive to people around them trying to be helpful, one error like that and failure to follow through is going to destroy any relationship that had been established. We've talked about this at length already, but provision of information and some of the roles specifically at the airport is very much information focused, because that's what people want. That's what they need. And especially in those first few hours, much of the information that is publicized, especially in the media, could very well be inaccurate. In fact, if you remember back to the video, the two newscasters that were portrayed, they talked about a flight from Detroit to Cincinnati or Toledo. In fact, they weren't even sure which. The fact of the matter, that was the first Comair accident in 1997. It was the first accident post-legislation. We, myself included, had opportunity to respond to that. And the fact is, the newscasters got it completely backwards. It was a flight from Cincinnati to Detroit. So oftentimes we are refuting what family members have heard on the media that is not correct. So one of the themes that you'll probably hear me say more than once today is we're always trying to tell what we know when we know it. And that's confirmed information, not speculating, but pretty much advising families and offering additional information as it becomes available, and then certainly delivering that news sensitively and compassionately. Family assistance also addresses basic needs. Go back to our Psych 101 course where we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We are talking about the very basic: food, shelter, safety. And these are the things that we are going to offer to families in the aftermath of an accident. Guiding principles, if you want to look at it this way, we're trying to protect, direct, and connect. And our role in the family assistance specialist role is to be an instrument in which those families become protected. We are going to be communicating directly, and we are there to provide information and support. Not counseling, but support. So where is family assistance provided? I think I mentioned we have a disaster response call center that we activate. This would be for aviation disasters as well as other kinds. And we're in the process of expanding the capacity with virtual seats. And again, you'll have additional information about that at some point down the road after we finish this training. We have promised our clients that we will have that activated within 1 hour. Most of our clients have their own specific toll-free number that will be publicized in the media, and that's where friends and family members will be invited to call to get information. So this is all about getting information, what has happened, and more specifically, what has happened to my loved one. Similarly, as we talked about, families are going to go to those airports. And that's another place that family assistance is delivered. Certainly at the Family Assistance Center, which is usually near or in the accident city or incident city, if there are survivors at the hospitals. And while this is not particularly common, we have in the past deployed responders to families' home communities. In other words, they didn't want to travel to the Family Assistance Center, but they were wanting to have the support and assistance offered. And so we deployed local mental health professionals or potentially had someone travel to that family's home community and spend that better part of a week with that particular family. So let's look at local assignments. If we look at the city where this occurs, in other words, where the airplane crashed or the facility was damaged or destroyed, the local assignments are going to be family waiting area specialists at the airport. If there are survivors, there will be this uninjured passenger area set up. Hospital coordinator I mentioned, and then if you happen to live in the city where the incident occurred, you may be asked to stand by briefly, but ultimately go to this hotel that is designated and start preparing that to become a family assistance center. And we'll talk about these stand-up roles a little bit later. So let's draw our attention back to the airport. This is a role that is so critical. It is literally going to be dealing with families in the first couple of hours. As I said, families may already be at the airport. If the crash occurs upon landing, you will have family members in baggage claim, circling the airport, in the cell phone area. And unfortunately, we're more greatly challenged because unlike the old days where family members were literally sitting at the gate, we could identify them fairly quickly. This, in our world today, we first need to identify who might be here waiting for a loved one to come off flight such and such. So I work a lot with our airline clients in our planning, and so our airport plan has to include things like, okay, how are we going to announce where family members should come? Well, typically family members are going to show up at the ticket counter. That's where they know to go for such and such airline. Unfortunately, stations, by the way, are simply an airline's presence at a particular airport, and that's just the terminology that's used. But stations are a critical source of information. We need to know about what is happening at the accident station. What are the first responders finding? What is the status of rescue and recovery? What family members are present at certain airports? And then more specifically, what are their particular needs or requests? And so this becomes a role that we will, in fact, ask you to help assume, because the station staffing, if you will, is often very limited. And I'm talking potentially 2 people on duty. And so they would never be able to handle the kinds of family assistance challenges that are posed by whether that place was where the flight took off from or was destined for. And so this is one of our key roles that potentially you will be asked to perform. Now, we'd be sending you literally to your own local airport. So the other thing that's also happening is that airline employees are most definitely also very much personally affected. I have never seen an industry, the only thing I can compare it to is somewhat the brotherhood of police and firefighters. But having worked in the industry and certainly been working with the industry for many, many years, I've never seen anything quite like it. This is a very close-knit, almost familial environment, and it doesn't matter if it's a small airline or a large airline. People are personally affected. They identify very much with their employer. They very well could know somebody on board the plane that went down, and they personally are going to have reactions to that accident. So you combine that with expecting those employees to deal with family members who obviously are in a highly anxious state in this very chaotic environment. Oh, and let's not forget, this is definitely where we're going to have some very immediate media intrusion. This really does present a huge number of challenges for those airline employees, and that's where we want to help not only augment personnel, but help support them. So if we were to ever deploy you, we would be asking you to go to the ticket counter. So if you hear of an accident and we ultimately get a hold of you, very oftentimes it's because you are living or working in the departure city airport or the destination city airport. And just like you will show up at the ticket counter, that's where family members are going to show up. But the goal is to escort these family members to a very private, secure area that is pre-identified at every airport. And sometimes it's called family waiting area. Some airlines call it family reception area. It's basically the same thing. It's at the airport, and it's very much a temporary place. Pre-identified, and it's not airline specific. So if you live close to Denver, for example, I believe Denver's airport family assistance or family waiting area is the British Air Club. Oftentimes the larger carriers, mileage clubs have a lot of amenities. They can be very much kind of sealed off and made private. In other cases, it's going to be a conference room. But that is where you will ultimately be spending probably the greater amount of your time. Now, another challenge we have is that if the pre-identified area is inside security or sterile area, we have to then also issue gate passes. And you as a responder are also going to need a gate pass to get through the security line. But all of that being said, we really want to ultimately provide this private area where we can keep the media out, we can protect people from curiosity seekers, and we can start to centralize how information is provided. So one of the things that happens in this area is, first of all, we're going to collect some basic demographic information. Who is the family member concerned about? And what is the family member's name and contact information? And we have some forms, and all of the things that I'm mentioning is part of the materials that accompany this training. And I encourage you to not only look through that, but probably wouldn't be a bad idea to also print. Because if we were to ask you to deploy, I think you'd find very helpful to have these checklists and these forms in your hands. Hopefully the airline has retained these informational materials, but I know that CCN is also going to have those available to provide to you if needed. The role within that family area that we've talked about is, again, trying to provide information as it becomes known. And I want to explain a little bit about this notification process. It really is a rolling, evolving process. We first are able to tell someone that your loved one and your loved one's name is on what we call a preliminary or unverified passenger list. Well, what does that mean? Basically, it means that that person held a reservation for this flight from, let's use Denver to Milwaukee. We have no idea. They may have even checked in, at the ticket counter or using one of those kiosks. But until we can confirm that they actually boarded the flight, having a name on a preliminary list is really not verification. So let's talk about that. What does that mean? Well, once we have a confirmed name list, what that means literally is that the airline has called upon the airport where the flight left, and let's say that was Denver in my example. They'll even wake up the agent, let's say maybe it was hours that have passed, they'll go back and wake up the agent who actually got people boarded, and they will go through every single boarding document so that we can say with assurance that so-and-so boarded this aircraft. And until you walk down the jetway and get into your seat, that's the process that needs to be confirmed. So we have that as kind of a second notification. And then finally, and hopefully, we will get information from the authorities at the scene that will ultimately confirm an individual passenger's status. Okay, so that is the rolling process that is supposed to take place within these family waiting areas. And similarly, that's exactly the same process that we are providing with family members via the call center. So pretty much the same objectives. I'm mentioning to you that this is not the role of a Red Cross volunteer for a very specific reason. We have seen, and this has played out both in actual accident response, even drills and exercises. If the airline employees on duty don't understand or are not familiar, even though we do our best to try to get these trainings and information pushed down to every employee, I can tell you it is an extreme challenge. So if, for example, someone is on duty who doesn't understand what they're supposed to do, hasn't reviewed the emergency plan, it is not unforeseen that when the Red Cross shows up, the local Red Cross chapter, they may in fact decide to abdicate responsibility to the Red Cross. And the fact of the matter is the airline is responsible for providing information, or what I'm calling conducting notification. You as a responder representing the airline can and might be called upon to do that. It is not, however, the role of the Red Cross. Now, what might the Red Cross be doing otherwise? Well, certainly they can be helping escort people from the ticket counter, maybe back to the family waiting area. They can help procure food and beverage, things like that. But remember, if you ever get to an assignment and it's not clear who's in charge, it should be an airline person, and potentially they will look to you to help them provide this notification. Okay? So if you get to the airport and we've asked you to deploy there, you might be asked to escort or help secure and maintain the privacy, maybe help with collecting information, but probably more likely is they're going to look to you as a mental health professional to be somewhat more prepared to deliver what can be extremely difficult information. The other thing I want you to be aware of is that you might be asked to also be kind of the communicator as to what is happening at that particular family waiting area, either in my example, Denver or Milwaukee, for example. And we have what we call a family assistance bridge. It's a telephone bridge. we're going to be connected, our command center, so to speak, we're going to be connected to the airline's command center. And what should happen is that potentially you, or at least the airline manager or supervisor, jumps on and off this bridge every 15 to 20 minutes so that we can all exchange information in real time. I cannot imagine responding to an incident without this very basic but very valuable tool. And so I want you to understand that the airport family waiting area person should be getting on the bridge, relaying information about what is happening in your particular area. Family members are upset about this, or they keep asking this question. So you're going to provide information about those families. You're going to kind of give an update, who is there, what notifications have been conducted. You're also, while you're on this bridge though, everyone's going to get updated as to what we know from the scene. And of course, that's ultimately the goal, is to be able to tell an individual family member what we know about their loved one. And that absolutely has to come from the first responders. This isn't in the airline's control. This is all about the first responders at the scene. And so we are dependent and waiting along with those family members until that becomes available. This is, it looks like a complicated picture, but essentially it's the information flow that should be occurring between all the various areas. And so you see the departure, airport, the airline command center. We've got that telephone bridge going. We're going to start to get information from the hospitals. And then you see also that generally the uninjured passengers are going to be transported back into the terminal, and there's usually an area there pre-identified for people to come into and to be assessed for additional needs. And then there might very well be the establishment of a temporary morgue. So all of those activity centers are joined by this need to communicate and flow information. So going back to your specific role, once we have this preliminary name list, and actually we will not activate the call center, and it would be very difficult to even open the family waiting area until we have this preliminary passenger list. Now that's going to be readily available. The airline locks out the flight that has had the accident, and they have that preliminary list. But remember, we want to describe the list accurately, and it is an unverified list. And we always want to not only provide the information that we know to be accurate, we always want to somewhat describe the next step. So it's important to describe, this is the unverified list. We do have that name on the list. However, we're in the process of retrieving those boarding documents and then comparing it to this list so that we can confirm who boarded the flight. Okay? Then the confirmed list becomes available. Now, generally, this should take less than an hour and a half to 2 hours. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as it sounds. It's not like the airline can just push a button. They do have to go back and gather up all of those boarding documents. And then we ask questions about whether there were any special, airline employees that traveled what's called non-revenue, which simply means as an employee, it's one of the perks that you get. Maybe they're supposed to have a ticket like everybody else, but maybe that procedure wasn't properly followed. Sometimes infants are not reflected the way they're supposed to be. An infant is supposed to, even if the infant doesn't have a seat, you're supposed to have a name connected to that infant. These are some of the things that have to be sorted out and confirmed before we get this confirmed name list. So once we have the confirmed name list, Obviously, the next step is waiting for this passenger status information. Now, if the accident occurs on the airport proper, this is probably going to be available within a couple of hours. If an aircraft has blocked a runway or somehow impeded the normal operation, those first responders not only have a desire to get people triaged and transported to the hospitals, but ultimately get the airport operation back to normal, so to speak. So we're not talking about hours and hours and hours. Now, if the accident occurs in a remote place, that's a different story, and we're going to be waiting much longer for that information. But the message that needs to be delivered is ultimately that it's one of several possibilities, that we have confirmed that your loved one is uninjured, and we can certainly escort you to be reunited with him or her. Or we have confirmed that your loved one has been transported to such and such hospital. We will arrange transportation and escort you there. Or there may be a kind of an in-between every hour to 2 hours, let's say, and time is just kind of dragging and dragging. The authorities might well have said, we still have not accounted for all the passengers, which means they haven't found all 120 or whatever the passenger count was. The most difficult message of all certainly is going to be the indication that the authorities at the scene have confirmed that there are no survivors or that your loved one is not among the survivors. And going back to the legislation that we talked about, one of the things that families bitterly complained about was that no one ever said they were sorry. Well, I'm convinced that that was all the lawyers and the insurance people who said, don't say that because, somehow that's admitting culpability, when in fact that is not what we're talking about. We are talking about the very human, basic, I am sorry for your loss statement, and that is definitely important to convey. So we give you some of that verbiage in the packets that you're going to have. There is nothing that is more difficult than delivering that message. But I must tell you, I have confidence that you can do that. I don't have the confidence that the 22-year-old kid on duty can do that. And so keep that in mind if you don't mind, because it is whoever is going to be there that has to, unfortunately, deliver these difficult messages. So the other thing I want to make mention of is we're trying to also then gather data. So whatever's happening in the Denver family waiting area has to get combined with the Milwaukee family waiting area. Oh, and by the way, we're also probably going to eventually become aware that at least a portion of passengers either started their day somewhere else or were planning to end their day somewhere else. So those are those connecting stations that I mentioned. So we may have people from Boise, Idaho, and Phoenix who flew into Denver. Well, those family waiting areas have now been set up because family members probably will show up at those airports. So this becomes kind of this domino effect. But ultimately, we want to gather what family members have we identified and how are we doing, basically, in notifying those family members. So what happens is we're trying to gather that, and we do that over the phone bridge. We also indicate that if you have the means of faxing some of these forms, but we can't rely on that. I mean, it's very likely that there's not going to be a convenient fax machine. And so we are asking for those updates so that we can compile this, and the goal is to ultimately be able to provide back to the airline, this is where we stand. For example, at 4 hours post-accident, the CEO of that airline in the press conference that he or she's going to have is able to say that we have notified or contacted 75% of the families represented by the passengers on board this flight. That's a good thing. And so it really is a measure of, quote, how well the airline is performing. These next few slides have a lot of information on them, and I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but there are 3 different checklists that are associated with this family waiting area, and you can read through those. I would encourage you to read through those carefully. We actually are suggesting that a mental health professional perform coordinator number 1 and coordinator number 3. Coordinator number 2 is kind of the logistics person outside the family area who's basically collecting information, and that would certainly be something an airline employee would be able to do. And if there's a choice, the choice would be that the mental health professional be the one who's actually conducting the notification inside the room or going to the family assistance bridge and providing those updates. This is just a picture of one of the forms that's in there. And again, this is kind of trying to gather things in aggregate so that we can start to compile it. We have a very robust database that ultimately this information becomes part of, but you at the airports in these first couple of hours, it's just not feasible to think that all of that can be adequately entered into the system. So much of what you're going to relay either on a form or via the bridge, phone bridge, is going to ultimately become part of the database, just to give you that perspective. So coordinator number 2, as I said, kind of sits outside of the area. They're not doing any notifying per se. They may go to the fax machine and do some logistical work. This is just one of the forms that we ask the family member to fill out, so we start to gather information about the family member and the victim. And then this is the checklist number 3, which really does get at kind of serving as the spokesperson. And literally we suggest that this person almost establish a pattern or a schedule. This person is going to the family assistance bridge, getting those updates, what we know from the scene, getting any and other kinds of updates, relaying, hey, here's what's going on at this particular airport, then going back into the family waiting area and providing those updates to the people waiting there. And one of the things that you will find, and if you stop and think about it, not surprisingly, 5-10 minutes seems like an eternity when you are waiting to hear about what has happened to your loved one. So it's really important that these updates or briefings take place, every 15-20 minutes or so, because families are desperate for any and all information. And actually, our standard procedure is that you should do that even if there's no additional updates or additional news. At least stand up there and say that much, because they're going to come to depend on that fact that you're going to come back into the room and you're going to be able to say something. It's when we leave families in a vacuum, believe me, and I've seen this play out even in drills, they will get very angry. And so if the airline, quote, hides or is not forthcoming with information, that's when people are going to get angry. We talked about this difficult message that if this is the case and there are no survivors, we have some verbiage for you. Certainly if there are survivors as well as fatalities, you really want to make sure that you have segmented people accordingly. If everybody is in the same situation, it's probably more feasible to think that these are going to be kind of general statements or announcements. But let's talk a minute about my Denver and Milwaukee scenario. If you're in Denver and the accident occurred in Milwaukee, not only have you done this notification, but as I said earlier, we want to explain what happens next. So this is where some of your judgment and skill will come in. You really need to assess how much information or how much additional information seems appropriate. Because as you well know, once you have delivered this very difficult news, that's all people are really going to hear. They're going to start to shut down after that. But it is important to at least convey that there is a process and that we're going to help them through that process. So we want to talk about that Family Assistance Center, and that's going to be set up in Milwaukee if that's where the plane went down. And the NTSB and the other authorities are going to be there. And if you want to go there, we're going to help arrange that travel, okay? So the people that are sitting in Denver, which is not the accident city, if you happen to be at the Denver airport and working with the airline folks there, you're going to probably get involved in coordinating those families' transportation back to their houses because they're local. We don't want people driving themselves back home, and so the airlines' emergency plans typically will call for, you know, arranging transportation, and obviously all of that gets paid for. If you are in Milwaukee, we may very well ask you to kind of help transition the families out of this airport area once the Family Assistance Hotel is identified. And that might be within a couple of hours. So that's another possibility. Certainly if there's uninjured passengers, we talked about this area within the airport. One of the best examples I can talk about with this particular challenge, and as strange as this may sound, accidents that have both fatalities and survivors are very much the more difficult scenario when it comes to responding. And as you can imagine, we need to be extremely careful about what we've told people if their loved one fits in this category versus that category. And you may remember, this is a few years ago now, but American had an accident in Little Rock, Arkansas, and it happened to be a flight where people were pretty much coming home. It was the evening, late evening, 10:30 at night, raining. I believe there were 2 people on duty. The first responders went to the wrong end of the airport initially, and family members saw the plane come in, and then waited and waited. And long story short, this is a really good example of the fact that there were fatalities, but many more people survived. And one of the challenges American Airlines had was to account for what had happened to all of those people. You had people literally walking away, getting in their cars and driving home. And so the uninjured passenger area needs to be staffed. We need to at least account for, you know, their names and the possibility that we're going to want to follow up with them as opposed to just disappearing into the night. So that's another possibility. The hospital coordination role. Now this is something to kind of tuck away too. This isn't necessarily widely communicated nor understood, but you'll know because we've talked about it, and that is post 9/11, the organizations involved in responding to these mass disasters anyway made a determination that the Red Cross would be the sanctioned entity to help track victims. In other words, when the first responders, which is typically going to be firefighting and emergency medical system personnel, you know, they're responding to victims as their status. In other words, it's not that they don't care, but they're really not collecting names or keeping track of who's going where. So recognizing that for these kinds of events, the airline has to ultimately account for what's happened to individuals. The Red Cross is going to be kind of our conduit of information. They are supposed to, at the time of a disaster, dispatch their personnel to the various hospitals and then work with the airline to identify who has been admitted to what facility. So to some degree, the HIPAA regulations are somewhat circumvented in these special circumstances. And so that might be another role that we would ask you to assume, and that would be certainly if you lived in or near the accident city. And just like everything else, some of it is collecting information and some of it is providing information, some of the forms. Now, let's go back to the accident city. Let's say you do live in the Milwaukee area, and we've sent a few people to the airport, but we've also then said to those that also live nearby, you know what, we want you to stand by for the first hour or two, because ultimately we need to set up this family assistance center. And the fact that we know we have family members sitting at the Milwaukee airport, we're going to want to transition them. This airport area is not going to be very large. It might have the amenities of, telephone or TV or, hopefully food and beverage has been brought in. But this is not a place where people want to stay for any length of time. We want them to be much more comfortable set up at this family assistance hotel. So we may in fact ask you to serve on this stand-up team, which using some diagrams and working with the hotel management and getting some direction from us, we're basically going to ask you to be the first boots on the ground to help get things set up. Okay, this would be particularly valuable and important if, let's say, the airline that we're talking about is based on the West Coast. It's going to take them some time to get to Milwaukee, and yet we have family members who have immediate kinds of needs. So again, these are very detailed in some of our informational packets that are part of the training, and they're checklist oriented. We've tried to make things very clear and concise, provide you kind of self-contained packets so that you know, even if you'd never looked at it before, pretty simple to understand what's trying to be accomplished. And so I would ask you to at least look through those and get familiar with what some of these coordination roles might look like. And this is really just a picture of this hotel and the various activity centers. It's more than just the hotel. Generally, we're looking for a large ballroom where the actual family briefings and meals will take place. The responders are going to have their own little operations center. Families are going to have a badging area. We need to have a check-in area. And so you see the various things that have to be set up within the hotel. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So let's talk about specifically the Family Assistance Hotel and some of the activities that go on there. First of all, as I said, usually it's a large convention-type center hotel because they're going to have the amenities that we're looking for. That large ballroom, and that really kind of becomes known as the Family Assistance Center. There's another mandate within the legislation, and it is that the airline set up what is called the Joint Family Support Operations Center. And of course, the government loves acronyms, and so that is maybe referred to as the JFSOC. And it's essentially a command center for all of the authorities to take part in. And so let's just review what some of those entities might be. Well, we've talked about the National Transportation Safety Board. There's a group that literally will be out at the accident scene and leading the investigation. And there's another small group, which will be back at the Family Assistance Hotel, who's helping coordinate the family assistance efforts and, quite frankly, kind of serving as a watchdog to make sure the airline is doing what they're supposed to. The Department of Justice is going to be involved because one of two things. They typically will be asked to respond because they have particular fingerprint expertise. And if there is any inkling or indication that this accident could have been a criminal act, the NTSB basically hands over the investigation to the FBI in that case. And after 9/11, it's almost like it's become reversed, where they first look at the accident characteristics and whatever the known facts are, and the FBI kind of takes the lead until criminal activity is ruled out, and then the NTSB takes over. The Department of State is a really valuable agency in aviation accidents. They have a particular responsibility to account for foreign nationals on board the flight. And I can tell you that the last 15 years since the legislation was passed, every single accident, and this has included 19-seat aircraft, and as well as the jumbo jets, there has been at least one foreign national on board. So we live in a very global, connected world, and so the Department of State is going to be the one to notify that consulate or that embassy. They're also going to be very helpful when it comes to expediting the travel of some of those foreign family members that might want to come to the U.S. And they also have some language interpretation resources that they will also make available. FEMA is not really heavily involved in disasters like this, although they are to provide voice and data resources if requested or needed. We've certainly seen the Department of Defense offer military installations, especially for the accidents that have occurred in the ocean, and using those installations to bring the wreckage back to, and some of the ocean recovery services that the DoD has to offer. The Red Cross, I mentioned earlier, they certainly will be part of the airport arena, but they will also be both the local chapter and the national team that will come out of Washington, D.C. They have some very specific responsibilities, and it's outlined in the legislation. They are responsible for, quote, family mental health, on-site child care, and spiritual care. The latter two are pretty self-explanatory. I just want to talk about that family mental health piece. And I mentioned very early on that you as a responder, even though you are a mental health professional, your role is not clinical or intervention focused. The fact of the matter is 98% of the families and the victims' loved ones that we will potentially encounter, they don't need counseling, they don't need crisis intervention. They are reacting to trauma, and 98% of those reactions are very, what we would call within the realm of normal for the situation. If there is, for example, a family member who is, threatening suicide or otherwise in need of mental health intervention, it is the Red Cross that's supposed to do that. But as I said, I can think of very few instances where that was needed, and as we've talked about, what is most needed is this information and support. The Department of Health and Human Services may be called upon. This is true not only for aviation accidents, but for other kinds of mass casualty events. The fact is, even in large cities, the local coroner or medical examiner are not going to be able to handle the numbers of people that we're talking about in terms of victim identification. So there's a very specialized team that becomes activated, and it's called the Disaster Operation Response Mortuary Team, DMORT, and that is their purpose, is to help support the ME or the local coroner in that victim identification process. Just a little bit about that team. It's about 1,000 or so forensic specialists that live nationwide. They also can bring to bear a mobile morgue wherever the accident scene happens to be. They are going to have some of their personnel working in the identification area, but others will be right within the family assistance hotel. And one of the things that happens there is that they will conduct what are called ante-mortem interviews with family members. Now, this would be the point at which, if the family member has chosen to bring medical or dental records with them, those would be presented. They don't have to bring them, and then if they don't, obviously the DMORT team is going to make sure that the medical physician or dentist provides those, and they can request those records. But the interviews are really, really difficult. There's like a 7-page form, and they're asking questions about that loved one in terms of surgeries, tattoos, scars, other kinds of things that would be potentially identifying those family members. And sometimes collection or samples are collected. So, blood or DNA swabs from the cheek, that could happen as well. These are really, really difficult conversations. You would not be part of those conversations, but certainly to the extent that a family that you've been assigned to work with has had that interview, my guess would be after that interview is over, they're going to appreciate some additional support. Then we want to talk about personal effects, which simply means what passengers took with them on the aircraft. And it's everything from what is on their person to the luggage and the backpack or the briefcase, anything and everything that is associated with that passenger. And as you might imagine, when victim identification is difficult and there's not a lot that is recovered, anything that is associated with that passenger, that loved one, becomes extremely important. And there's a couple of companies, but one of the companies that we will frequently work with is known as BMS Catastrophe, and they provide these services worldwide, and they have this expertise in helping recover and restore and then returning these items to the families in the aftermath of the accident. And I'd like to show you a couple of videos that kind of illustrate and explain this process to you. The first one is a story or a view of BMS CAT and the company and the operation. And that's followed by 2 videos that I think really illustrate this whole topic in a way that I could never accurately describe. And what you'll be viewing is the story of 2 widows who lost their husbands in the Colgan air crash that took place in a cold winter night in Buffalo a couple of years ago. And they first looked through this catalog that presents all the items that were recovered. And then the second video shows those women, in fact, receiving back some of those personal effects. Again, if you find yourself particularly moved by these videos, not to worry. It's hard not to have a reaction that is emotional in nature.
At first glance, they are forgettable items. Shattered sunglasses, a small purse, shredded clothing, negatives, a Marine Corps pin. They all belong to people who were in a plane crash, and now these items mean the world to loved ones. They were retrieved by Global BMS, the only company working with U.S. airlines to recover personal items after a crash.
Look at this, and doesn't the sheer violence of what happened really hit home when you see something?
Yeah, that certainly does. So again, we recognize we're here to serve the people.
BMS gave me an exclusive tour of the warehouse that processes personal effects from air disasters. Company executive Mark Rocco goes through a crash site with emergency officials in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. Scores of his employees will salvage anything they can. It is sobering, somber work.
It'll rip you to shreds. You'll shed tears like anybody else when you talk about stories, and you'll tear up when you go back on those.
Carriers pay BMS millions of dollars after a disaster to make sure the job is done right.
It's clean, safe to handle, and it's odor-free. So you don't smell anything from the incident. No
like
jet fuel,
fire,
no smoke odor, etc.
A pilot's wings, perhaps the last photographs a person ever took. Shredded clothes, socks. BMS carefully wraps and returns all items.
You wrap them up like it's the most important thing they'll ever receive.
It is. We don't want it to look like a gift, and yet we don't want it to look like it was just thrown in a box.
This weathered Michael Connolly book means the world to Dan Vinton, one of those who walked away from the miracle on the Hudson.
As bad as this looks, it is readable. We're just blessed that we're here as a family together, and lucky.
In 1996, Congress passed the Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Act, mandating airlines do everything possible to return items to survivors or the next of kin. Items are photographed, cataloged, BMS returns what it can, and it may seem like a repetitive job, but Dan Watson, who takes all the pictures for BMS, says there is no question some stand out.
Captain Sullenberger's library books.
Of course, Sully is the hero pilot who landed the U.S. Air jet on the Hudson River. Once all the items have been categorized, and a few months after the crash, family members can look at a secure website to claim items. As you may expect, the job gives Rocco a new outlook on life.
It's a very humbling experience. You know, one, you don't take life for granted, so you're thankful to see the sun come up every day.
Sean Caleb's, CNN, Fort Worth, Texas.
Well, it is a heartbreaking task for two women who lost their husbands on Flight 3407. Tonight, News 4's Rob Macko joined Robin Tolsma and Jennifer West as they identified their husbands' final personal effects. This is a story you will see only on News 4.
It's another painful step for Robin Tolsma and Jennifer West.
I want to look at his shirt because if he was wearing it, I want to see how badly it is. That's it. That's all that's left.
With lists in hand, they go online to identify their husband's personal effects recovered from the crash site in Clarence Center.
That's it. That's definitely his ring. Yeah, that's his ring. I wish you could see the inscription, but it's his ring.
Things we take for granted, clothing, baby pictures, and house keys, unleash emotions.
Yeah.
Darren Tolsma and Ernie West sat next to each other on Continental Flight 3407. They both worked at Northrop Grumman, a Williamsville defense contractor.
I couldn't imagine going through any of this without her at this point. I mean, she's become more like a sister to me.
Oh, it meant everything. If I didn't have Robin, I don't know if I'd be strong enough to do this alone.
The women first met in January when they attended this company party with their husbands. They're now inseparable. They need each other to get through this and marvel at the fact some items weren't damaged.
After going through this process, they discover that some of the items listed on the computer do not belong to either of their husbands, but they are still missing a few items.
Darren's wallet, Ernie's watch, and Ernie's wedding ring, shown in this picture with their now 2-year-old daughter, Summer. That's hard for Robin.
For me, the hard part is knowing that it's there, but knowing that Ernie's isn't there. You know, I mean, mine won't feel right until I know Jennifer has Ernie's back.
I want everything of him back, whether it's in pieces or fragments. I believe he would do the same for me.
Now, the victims' families have 30 days to pick out which items they want delivered to them. A month or so after that, they'll get another list of items that other families passed over, meaning this painful process will start all over again. Reporting live, Rob Macko, News 4 at 11.
To an outsider, they don't hold much meaning, but to the families of the victims of Flight 3407, they mean everything.
Tens of thousands of items have been recovered from the crash site. And two women who lost their husbands on that fateful night invited News 4's Luke Moretti to be there when some of those personal effects were delivered. He has the story now in tonight's special assignment.
A wedding ring.
Last time I held this in my hand was on our wedding day.
A wallet with baby pictures.
All 4 pictures, perfect condition.
They are things, possessions, personal effects, like this keychain.
Okay.
To the outsider, they mean little. For Robin Tolsma and Jennifer West, they mean a great deal. It's a special connection to the husbands they lost so tragically.
Every new piece we find, it's more unanswered questions. And I just miss him so much. And
Ernie West and Darren Tolsma were among the passengers who died when Continental Connection Flight 3407 crashed in Clarence Center in February. They both worked for Northrop Grumman and were seated next to each other on the plane. In a matter of seconds, their lives, along with 48 others, were extinguished. Now, for the first time, these women are coming face to face with the personal effects their husbands carried with them on the plane. There's the wedding ring Darren Tolsma had on his finger.
I don't want to believe that, he died with his wedding ring on. I know he did, but, the fact that it's back on my hand and it was on his hand.
50 crash victims, 50 families hoping to retrieve something, anything worn or carried by their loved ones. Sadly, that's not always possible.
There are cases where nothing has been associated to a passenger. Those loved ones have been notified of that.
Dan Bailey of Texas-based Global BMS, which was involved in the recovery of personal effects following the disaster, says there's possibly 30 to 40,000 items from the plane and the home that was destroyed.
I have no idea what these folks have been through. I can't imagine what they've been through. But for us to be able to bring back a possession to them, we are in hopes that it will be something in a very perfect keepsake for them in the years ahead.
There's Ernie West's company ID card, license, and badly damaged wallet. Yet the 4 pictures of his baby girl Summer that he carried in the wallet were virtually untouched.
I want her to know that he loved her so much that he protected the pictures. Why did the pictures survive and the wallet didn't?
There are lingering questions, perhaps some that will never be answered. And while these personal items offer some comfort, they'll never replace the lives lost.
It's never ending, and I think days like today take us right back to February. I think maybe we're stronger than we were in February, but I think that the heartache is just there.
The heartache isn't over. Later this month, more personal effects, those originally classified as unassociated items, will be delivered to family members. For Jennifer West, the scheduled delivery will happen on her birthday. Luke Moretti, News 4.
So we've talked about activity at the Family Assistance Center, and basically the twice daily briefings that occur, and they are led by the NTSB, really kind of establish a schedule for the family assistance operation. These briefings become really important, and the NTSB is very committed to making sure that families receive all information that they possibly can to answer their questions. And so what you find is that we will have both the medical examiner and probably the investigator in charge at the scene coming to those briefings and hopefully answering those questions as best as possible for the family members. And those are generally held in the morning and then in the early evening. Families are also going to want to visit the actual scene, and that's generally going to take place on the 3rd day or so because all the biohazards need to be cleaned up. Generally, the wreckage has also been removed, so it's simply looking at the where the plane went down. And these are instances where we have generally set up a perimeter around the scene itself. Sometimes hay bales and other kinds of barricades are established, and family members will frequently bring flowers and leave them behind as a part of that visit. The memorial service is kind of the culmination of the family assistance response, generally held at the end of that week. This is where, just to mention to you, this is where a lot of the issues associated with cultural diversity will emerge. So one of the things that we are doing almost from the beginning is trying to acknowledge all the different religions that happen to be represented by the passengers on board. And so one of the things I will say to you is that we will never be expert in all the languages or the cultural beliefs of people all over the world, and yet they really are not the obstacles or challenges that you think they might be. And what we have found is that it's very simple. If we don't know, we're going to ask. The greater danger is to make assumptions that we think we know what this particular religion believes or what this family might need. And so always remember, if you don't assume but rather ask, family members are very willing to tell us what it is that's important to them. One of the things that might very well occur is that we have some religions who very much want to be able to bury their dead within a certain time frame. And as we've discussed, with the kind of fragmentation and devastation that often occurs, that may simply not be possible. So we have brought in the leader of that particular faith to come and speak to those family members directly to explain the difficulties that are going to be encountered, and basically to say it's going to be okay because this deviation from what would normally be practice has become a necessity. The other aspect of the memorial service, and this is generally going to be planned by the Red Cross and a team of people that we designate, you're pretty much going to start working on a memorial service almost from the first day, because there is a lot to be done in a very short time frame. But family members of previous aviation accidents are likely also to be in attendance, and this is just something that has evolved over the years. It is that family group's way of showing support and caring for this next group of people who suffer the loss of their loved one in an accident. These are just some pictures of both the Colgan Buffalo crash that was in February, and then Lexington, Kentucky. You may remember that a very early morning flight took off the wrong runway and crashed at the end of that particular runway. And the other picture is there to show you the doves that are kind of obscuring that gentleman's face, but doves and balloons and other kinds of symbolic items are often part of this memorial service, and that those are things that families as a group decide upon. So what does this team look like when we talk about the Family Assistance Center? Well, we've certainly talked about the NTSB and their Transportation Disaster Assistance Team, who are the family assistance focused group, as opposed to the investigator group, who are entirely at a different hotel and who go to the accident scene every day, and that's their purpose and role. The airline team, the size and composition is going to vary depending on the size of the airline, the amount of resources, but typically it's going to include one person who is somewhat designated as the liaison for the airline in working with the NTSB and with us, for that matter. Hopefully there is a senior executive. One of the issues that has emerged from previous accidents is that an airline has sent someone whose title may have, let's say, been a director, and family members were very much angered by that fact, because that really conveyed to them, or perceived by them, was, that airline doesn't care too much that they only sent this, quote, lowly director. Where is the vice president, or even more appropriately, where is the CEO or president? And that has come to be an expectation. Finance folks and the insurance representatives are going to be there working together, and generally we're talking about all these associated expenses are going to typically be insurance reimbursable. So that kind of working relationship gets established very quickly right at that family hotel. The other thing that I think I mentioned earlier is that some of our clients have what we call an employee staff care team, and our role may be very different if, in fact, most of their employees are assigned to these families. So there's a lot of different models out there, and we need to kind of be prepared to potentially insert ourselves in a variety of ways. But our team will generally consist of a director, a couple of managers. One will focus predominantly on the family assistance aspect, and that's generally going to be somebody from CCN. And then there will be an operational manager, and that probably will be someone like myself or one of my colleagues. There are going to be team leaders named, and then we're going to talk about two kinds of assignments, both a family assistance and an operational assignment. So again, we have kind of these, a continuum of airline clients and different models. So we need to be prepared to deploy potentially, at least 200 people if we are serving, let's say, an aircraft that had 100 passengers on board. We almost deploy in a 2-to-1 ratio, because not only do we need to assign 1-to-1 family assistance specialists, we also have a tremendous need for operational specialists. And we also need to consider this is a 24/7 operation. So typically we're going to name kind of the day shift or the AM shift, and then we will have literally a second team that will handle the PM shift, because that is the nature of this kind of response. I mentioned this care team. One of the things that I want you to be aware of is generally these care teams are comprised of employees who have a desire to help if an accident occurs. They have gone through usually what is a 1 to 2 day training. And again, as we've talked about, these are not necessarily clinical roles, and so it's not that they can't perform some of these tasks. But one of the things and one of the values of having this mental health support integrated is that one of the things that we have found that is very difficult to teach and much less kind of display as a behavior is this whole notion of boundaries. And this is where you as a mental health professional certainly add to the definition of what that really means. So we'll talk about the fact that you may be asked to pretty much be monitoring the well-being of an employee care team, and not only their well-being, but that whole boundary issue as well. The upshot of this description for you is that we really do want you to be able and willing to accept either a family assignment or an operational assignment. And as you can see from this diagram, there are a number of roles that have to be filled. This is as important an aspect, and this really kind of reflects what the family assistance efforts consist of, and it's everything from meeting and greeting the families that are starting to arrive in that accident city, because our goal is to literally go to the airport and escort them back to this family assistance hotel. We need to be paying attention to, do we have enough hotel rooms? We're going to have badging, someone paying attention to nothing but planning meals, ground transportation, and all the other things that you see listed there. So you as a specialist could be assigned on a 1-to-1 basis with a passenger family, and if you are, always important to remember that you truly are the primary representative of that airline. We're going to assign you a local cell phone. We want you to bring your cell phone with you, your personal cell phone, because that's how we'll communicate with you, at least in the first few hours as you're in transit. But once you get on site at the family hotel, we want you to have a local cell number that family members are then given. We do not want you to have your personal cell phone number out there for family members to have. So the other thing to think about is there are going to be certainly lots of needs for just kind of meeting those basic needs, and so we need to be prepared to do everything from, maybe going to buy clothing. A family who lives in Miami that might need to travel to Milwaukee in January is probably not going to have the right type of outerwear for sure. Child-related, formula, diapers, things like that, toiletries. So all of that becomes part of addressing the family member's needs. You will usually be invited or able to attend those NTSB briefings, and one of the values of that is that you can take notes, and knowing that family members are not processing information as well as they typically would, this becomes helpful to be able to answer questions or help clarify issues that still remain kind of fuzzy for family members. And by the same token, if families start to, as a group, have the same questions and we relay that to our team leaders, then it becomes apparent that the medical examiner or the NTSB needs to do something different or do a better job of explaining that particular issue. So you truly are kind of this conduit of information to push up and down. You are probably going to be invited, but certainly if you're not comfortable, you don't have to attend the memorial service. And it doesn't happen often, but sometimes families ask for an escort back to their home community. The operational specialists that you saw in that diagram, pretty self-explanatory. Everything from meet and greet, the whole check-in process, making sure we have enough hotel rooms. And just a note about that, you will be staying at a different hotel, or that's the goal anyway. We want you to be in a place where you can get away and have your downtime, and family members are going to hopefully be within that one roof under the hotel that's been designated as the Family Assistance Center. So your hotel is generally going to be nearby, but different. Badging is something that the company we talked about earlier, BMS CAT, they're going to bring equipment and personnel that know how to work the equipment, because badging becomes a security measure. Sometimes badging is changed on a daily basis to pretty much, make sure that the people that need to be and belong there are the ones that are actually there. There has been, in the last few years, I can think of several instances, though, that despite best efforts, the media and other kinds of folks, in fact, there's a group of people out there known as kind of the disaster junkie group, and they're going to try to get in just because that's what they enjoy doing, and they want to hear and they want to be involved. So badging is a way that we can ensure that we're keeping out some of those folks that don't belong. Ground transportation, generally we are going to have a block of rental cars, and you as a responder will drive those cars as opposed to the family members. And we talked about the cell phones and some of those other resources. The group events are those two kind of larger scale activities, the site visit and the memorial service, and that will be beginning to be worked on right away. We'll have somebody or maybe a couple people designated as a Red Cross liaison and the personal effects vendor liaison. And then a team leader is really someone who's not going to be specifically assigned to a family, but rather assigned to a group of either care team members or a group of specialists. And their primary role really is to kind of do the morning briefing and the evening debrief. And that is going to be part of our procedure and process. It's important. We have integrated that into the process because we believe it's necessary, and we don't want, whether it's a care team member or even a mental health professional responding, we don't want you to become a secondary victim, and it's important to monitor everybody's well-being, and particularly with the airline care team members. This next slide is really just kind of a view of the accident response timeline. I'll let you look at that in greater detail, but suffice it to say that while we'll be probably involved for that week or so period, this continues very much on after that time. Once the family member has obtained legal counsel, the airline relationship pretty much changes. It shifts to being a legal relationship. And oftentimes the one-year memorial service is the point at which families want to gather, and the airline is not invited. They are expected to pay for the memorial and the either plaque or some kind of construction monument that's erected, but the airline really is not part of that process. And in many cases, the litigation will continue, into the years. Oftentimes, the actual findings, the NTSB's determination of the cause of the accident can take several years. Families obviously keep very much involved in keeping up with that process, and they are invited to those hearings and to listen to what's being said about the cause. We want to talk briefly about the activation process, and just some of this is going to be a little bit of a recap, but hopefully you kind of glean that the priority in terms of the time frame is that we know that family members are either at or going to show up quickly at those airport family waiting areas. So that really becomes our priority, that with the call center, to get activated and staffed. Then we'll kind of shift our focus in looking at who lives geographically proximate to wherever this family assistance center is going to be established. There's also going to be more of the typical response in terms of what you are often called upon to do, and that would be we're supporting family members and victims certainly, but we're also supporting our airline organization and its employees. So just like you oftentimes are asked, you might be asked to deploy to a location at which the airline has groups of employees. And some of the groups that are very heavily impacted and very quickly impacted, as you might imagine, are the maintenance facilities. It's very easy to understand that as soon as word of an accident comes out, one of the first questions is, oh my gosh, did I fail to do something, or did I do something wrong in working on that particular aircraft? The reservation agents have probably taken many phone calls, and they themselves are pretty much going to be traumatized. So those are some of the other potential deployment locations. Again, more traditionally what you would think of as a critical incident response. Again, if you live in the accident city, we have those hospital and uninjured, potentially, passenger areas to staff, and then the Family Assistance Center hotel itself. As far as kind of the deployment process, it may vary in terms of the client involved. So we need you to be flexible. You may be asked to call an airline's reservation center, a specific travel agency, or you may be asked to book your own ticket and be reimbursed, and just be assured that you will be. It's pretty safe to say that you're going to want to pack 7 or so days worth of business casual clothing. We ask you to bring formal attire for that memorial service. And certainly, please pack your personal items, especially those related to leisure time. If you like to run or do yoga, bring your shoes, bring your particular exercise clothing, because that becomes an important part of your self-care. And always good to have your driver's license and cell phone with you. We don't have a lot of international airline clients, but some of them do fly internationally. So there is a possibility that we could be asking you to deploy to Mexico, the Caribbean, or Canada. And certainly if that's an issue for you, you certainly can defer the assignment, but there is that possibility. I think we've talked mostly about this, so just as a summary, depending where you live, that may dictate what role we may ask you to perform. And that's going to very much obviously be dictated by the accident or the event itself. I have to say a few things about self-care. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to respond to a larger scale incident, I think you'll be a bit surprised at, while self-care sounds pretty straightforward and simple, it may not be, and there's some reasons for that. I don't worry so much about the during the response, the whole boundary issue. I think there's real value in having those mental health professionals be part of the process, because even among the airline employees, you're going to model what needs to be a part of this, and that is, you really should be preparing to say goodbye when you first begin this. There is a beginning and an end, and that's the way it needs to be. So some of the negatives that have come out of some of the care team scenarios are that, they continued the relationship, they, went to graduations and sent Christmas cards, and the relationship really should not have continued past the role that took place at the Family Assistance Center. And it was not healthy for either that employee or the family, obviously. So we want you to pay attention to your needs. One of the things I think that really makes it difficult is that adrenaline is so much a part of this response. It is very misleading. You will feel like the Energizer Bunny and that you can keep going and going and going. And the fact is, adrenaline will take you a long way, but it will finally have you hit the wall. And so just being aware of that and making sure that you're eating, you're taking breaks and getting proper sleep. Some of the things that you're going to be advising the family you might be assigned to, the same thing applies to you. And it's, I guess what I'm trying to say is easier said than done, because it is more difficult to be cognizant that, I need to get my sleep and I need to probably stop to eat, or I need to take a break, because you're not probably going to want to, but it is very important. And as we've talked about, we want you to maintain contact with home. We obviously don't want you, providing confidential details, but you need to maintain that contact with your support system. And so just a word about this transitioning back home, two things. Some of our most valuable lessons learned come right from you. Certainly on a daily basis, we want you to be providing information about what's working well, what's not, what needs to be changed. And then we kind of do this final exit interview where we can really kind of gather all of the lessons learned and make sure that we've integrated them for the future. We caution you to be aware that you're going to have an emotional reaction just like some of these families, and that you need to be not only aware of that, but to consider the implications. And so there might be a grieving process that you yourself go through. In any event, I think it's safe to say that this will change you. And so just like we caution those that have suffered loss, don't make those major decisions in the immediate aftermath. This is kind of a process that you need to integrate into your own framework, and it's not a good idea to make major decisions as you're getting through that. So a couple of final things and thoughts. Maybe after listening to this training, you've decided this isn't for you, and that's fine. I hope that you've gleaned the fact that we are asking you to perform a role that is not clinical in nature. You may be asked to go to Walmart to buy diapers. You may be asked to sit with someone and just listen. And truly, there's a lot more listening than talking that generally goes on. And we always want to keep whatever that family needs uppermost as our goal. So think about that. Also think about the fact that while I've talked about an emergency plan and I've talked about checklists and forms, I can tell you that at best we are talking about organized chaos. And you need to be okay with handling that environment. You need to be able to tolerate ambiguity. And if that's not you or your personality type, if you need things much more structured, this may not be for you, and that's okay. If you decide that this is something you want to do, we really want you to think about what will it take for you to be able to, and pretty much quickly able to deploy and be gone from both your home and work for probably a week or so. And then be willing to be part of some training and chat sessions that we'll be doing ongoing, as well as maintaining your demographic data. That's really important. If we're going to get a hold of you quickly and efficiently, we need to make sure we still have your correct phone numbers and email addresses. Just a couple of points about important policies. Obviously, confidentiality should go without saying. Your speaking to the media is strictly prohibited. That is both during the event and the response as well as post-event. Engaging in any activity that could be construed as solicitation of clients for future therapeutic relationships is also prohibited. And we're going to ask you to maintain a timesheet and try to retain all of your receipts so that the finance people will be happy with us and we can get all the reimbursement that we should. So as kind of final steps, after listening to the training, I really encourage you to review those hard copy materials. If you're like me, you may want to print them as opposed to just reviewing them on the screen. And then you're going to be asked to take a quiz. And the quiz is not meant to be difficult. It is going to be, just like the training content, I think, it's information not particularly familiar to you. So you really should review this fairly thoroughly because we've assured, especially our airline clients, that you have received some pretty specific training in aviation disaster response. So that's important, and we need you to be able to demonstrate that. We also are going to give you attestation for contact hours, recognizing that you are taking your time and that we appreciate that. So you have that certificate for continuing education. And then just as a final thought, I wanted to make mention of the fact that we've spent the day talking about aviation accidents and all of these fairly somber issues. But I do want to remind us that flying is extremely safe. We take much more risk every day walking across the street and driving our car to and from the airport. And you may be interested in this calculation that a passenger would have to fly 24 hours a day for over 400 years before that approximates the chances of being involved in a fatal accident. So the other statistic I found recently that even amazed me is look at the number of flights that are in the air every day. And when you think about it, and we're often asked, well, how often is this going to occur? There hasn't been an accident, a major U.S. accident for 2010 or 2011 yet. And so these do not happen frequently because of the safety of this particular industry. And this final screen is literally kind of a shot of the Earth, and each of those yellow dots represents the aviation industry in motion, the fact that the flights and the aircraft movement worldwide, and I think it really reflects the fact that we are this extremely global and mobile world. And as a final thought, just to keep that in mind. So thank you very much for participating in the DART team. I hope you've enjoyed the training. I look forward to speaking with you in the future.